Good morning or good afternoon, and now it's 12, so good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to ION Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs, African Studies Center, Michigan State University. And ION Africa is our weekly seminary series. And today I'm very delighted to have Dr. Horman Chitonge from the University of Cape Town with us today, and the topic of his talk is Transforming the Colonial Economy in Africa, a Vital but Incomplete Project. So a brief introduction of Dr. Chitonge. He's a professor and head of African Studies at the University of Cape Town. He is a research fellow at the Global Justice Program, Yale University, a research associate at PRISM, School of Economics, and a visiting fellow at the African Studies Center, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. His research interests include agrarian political economy, hydropolitics, and alternative strategies for economic growth in Africa. His most recent books include Industrial Policy and the Transformation of the Colonial Economy in Africa, the Zambian Experience, Routledge 2021, so very recent one. Another book is Industrialising Africa, Unlocking the Economic Potential of the Continent in 2019, Peter Lang, and Social Welfare Policy in South Africa, From the Poor White Problem to a Digitized Social Contract. That one came in 2018. Thank you so much for being here, and I hand it to you, Professor Chitonge.
Thank you very much. As I can't see my slides, can we move to? Let me share my slide again. Yeah, there we are. Yes, thank you everyone for coming to the meeting, and thank you first of all to the African Studies Center at MSU. I am very delighted to be here and to speak on this topic. As the program director has mentioned, I'm from the University of Cape Town, and I work on industrial policy mostly, and then other related areas. So what I'll speak about today is the challenge that we have in the continent, which from where I sit, it relates to transforming, or what I often refer to as reversing the colonial economic logic. So when colonialism was introduced in Africa, there was a logic that underpinned it. And there are other logics, cultural, political, and so on. But I want to focus today on the colonial economic logic and make an argument that for Africa to move forward, we need to tackle that challenge. And I want to be very upfront and start with my main points in the paper. Of course, I'm starting off with the key, the argument that the key features of the colonial economy are still alive in Africa today, and I'll spend a bit of time just illustrating what these features are, and what problems the challenges that they engender on the continent. My second point, of course, is a premise that colonial economy was not primarily established to serve the interest of Africa and its peoples. And of course, I know there's been a lot of argument about what was the benefit of colonialism to Africa. Some people arguing it brought civilization, it brought technology, it brought modern healthcare and so on. But overall, I want to be bold and make the argument that whatever was done during colonialism, it was not for the interest of Africans and the continent at large. Yeah. So that's my second point. My third point flows from there and hinges at the core of the paper. And it's the idea that if colonialism was not established to save the interest of African people, then there is an urgent need for Africans to reorient the economy. Because the economy, if we agree that it was not established to serve the African interests, as we'll see in the paper, then it's up to us Africans then to begin to think of how to reorient this economy so that it serves the interest of majority of Africans. And I want to emphasize the phrase there, majority, because there are some Africans who benefit from the persisting structures of a colonial economy. But there are very few, and some of them very rich, yes. But we want to see a continent that transforms itself so that the economic activities and the resources on the continent are oriented towards benefiting majority of the Africans. My fourth point is that transforming the colonial economy would require a radical break with the current thinking behind the approaches to economic growth and development. And the radical, so we will need a radical intervention. The current thinking that's largely is framed around the dominant mainstream neoclassical economic thinking won't take us far. And we have seen this over the past 6 decades, 60 years, that we haven't moved far. So I make the argument here that we need, for a radical break, we need a radical intervention. My fifth point is, of course, responding to the question that is obvious, that if we are going to transform the colonial economy on the continent, what should we do? What we need to, what instruments, what tools do we have to do that? And I want to argue that industrial policy, and I'll explain not just a conventional industrial policy, but what I'm referring to as frontier industrial policy, can be used as an instrument for reversing what I refer to as the colonial economic logic. And the reason behind that is that industrial policy, in its radical form, addresses itself to or seeks to tackle the core of the colonial economic rationale, which was extractivism that saw the continent as a source for raw materials. So industrial policy can, reverse that by saying, instead of us just exporting raw materials, let's begin to add value and make things on the continent. Then my last key point is that it speaks to the idea of an incomplete project. And that's the idea that, the transformation of the colonial economy started, there were some attempts in the past, especially immediately after independence. But the project was has been incomplete. And I would argue that since the 1980s, it was largely abandoned. But we are seeing, and this is where a bit of hope is coming up. We are seeing the agenda for transforming the colonial economy back on the policy discussions, and we hope that we will see this gain momentum as we go forward. So those are the main points I make, and the rest will be supporting some of these points that I've just put up in front. And I want to start by just highlighting what are these features of the colonial economy that are surviving today. And I want to start with this graph here. So this is a graph that is showing the share of commodity in total export in from African countries in 2010, 2014, and 2017. And what you see here is a clear dominancy of commodity in the export of African countries. We see, some countries, for instance, Algeria, Angola, Chad, we see that almost 100% of what they export is raw materials, so commodities. And commodities defined in this sense include agricultural produce, minerals, oils, and fuels, and so on. And this is coming from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. UNCTAD does a report on commodity dependency. They do a report almost every 2 years, at least starting from 2009. And so this is where this is coming from. And what's clear is that in some cases we see, a very insignificant drop between 2009 and 2017. But in some cases we see, in some countries, sorry, we see an increase. For example, in Chad, we see an increase. Also in countries like Nigeria, we see an increase in the composition or the share of commodity in total export. And the point here is that the colonial economy was structured in the same way that it would actually just extract raw materials or commodities in general from the African continent. And this is 2017, we see a same structure. Yeah. So this is one indication of that persistence of the colonial economic feature. This graph is just showing, if we compare regions, regions within regions within Africa, that's Central Africa, East Africa, North Africa, Southern and West Africa, and then to other regions like Central America. We see also that there is that the continent is predominantly a commodity exporter. That very little manufactured products go into the export basket from the continent. If you compare that to even Central America, which is below 30% on average, particularly in 2017, and East Asia, of course, much lower. Caribbean, of course, as well, slightly better than most of the continent. And we see that in some regions like East Africa and Southern Africa, we see the commodity the commodity dependency deepening. This is a picture. This is an image from the 2019 UNCTAD commodity dependency report, and you can see the concentration of that. Predominantly, African countries have a higher share of commodity in their export. Most of the countries export between the share of commodity export in total export is about between 80 to 100%. Very few countries like South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco there, with a little bit of a gray shade that is between 40 to 60. Again, this picture shows the dominancy of commodity in African exports. This table here also speaks to the same point, and I'm spending a bit of time here just to highlight that this is 2017, and what it does is it gives you the three top commodity exports, and also and their share in total export, and at the end we have the export concentration index. So, for instance, if you take Angola, Angola's first one, the top commodity export, which is petroleum, accounts for 97.3% of total export. And actually, we don't even have anything else. And one commodity which is petroleum, accounts for 75% of total export. You can see for other countries as well that there's quite heavy dependency on commodities. If you look at also the commodities that are exported, but except countries like Mauritius, where you have actually almost 40 goods that make up the 75%. But countries like Angola, Burundi, Congo, Nigeria, you have only one or two commodities that make up 75% of total export. And also you can see the corresponding indicator there in terms of export concentration index, which shows you that the closer you are to one, that's an indication that you are overly dependent on one commodity. The far away, the closer you are to zero, that means that your export basket is more diversified. And you can see that for most countries, there is a huge concentration, export concentration, and mostly in commodities. Right. The second, that's the first part of the first indicator of the persistence of the colonial economy on the continent. The second one is what I'm referring to as lack of internal coherence. And here I actually cite Claude Ake, who was writing, even way before that, defining internal coherency, as a key feature of the colonial economy, in the sense that the different sectors are not complementary to each other, that they are not properly connected, they are not functioning. In a sense, the sectors are disarticulated, and I'll speak to that just in a moment. Internal coherence, so the lack of internal coherency is a feature of a colonial economy, because the colonial economy was set up to extract materials, and in most cases, in a haphazard or hard work manner, that the extraction of tea had nothing to do with the other sectors. Tea was extracted and taken out for processing. The extraction of minerals had nothing to do with anything else. On the other hand, if we look at, internal coherency is what defines a mature and developed economy that has stronger and more powerful interlinkages between the sectors, meaning and the idea of backward and forward linkages, which was strongly articulated in Hirschman in his book. So internal coherency is a feature of a mature economy supported by a strong manufacturing sector and supporting services. We don't see much of that on the continent, and it's also another sign that that the economies have not actually been transformed. They are still operating within with the same colonial economic logic. The idea of linkages, of course, comes from the point that different parts of the economy interact with each other to produce goods and services. And in a more internally coherent economy, we have much stronger integration or coherence than in economies that lack that internal coherence. They, of course, want to just move to the issue of the linkages. Of course, we have different types of linkages. With fiscal linkages, for instance, the money that is made from minerals is spent on the country in a coherently, in an internally coherent economy. The fiscal linkages refer to the money that is made in different sectors being sprayed out. But you will see on the continent that much of the money actually leaves the continent and that leaves the continent a perpetually capital scarce continent. That we have to rely on money that was made in Africa goes out to somewhere else, and then we have to rely on the same money to come back. And that's a sign of lack of fiscal linkages. That there's production linkages, involving backward and forward linkages. There's side stream infrastructure linkages, which I'll speak to. There are linkages, within agriculture between sectors, and technology as well. That you develop technology that is connected to what is being done in other sectors. The same with knowledge. That you produce knowledge that is relevant. That's a coherent economy that produces technology and relevant knowledge and technology. Whereas in the continent, we rely on knowledge that's produced elsewhere, and we use and recycle it. Of course, there are horizontal linkages and so on. There are other ways of the other images there, just showing the idea of linkages, that you have economy sectors that pull from each other, and that creates multipliers within the economy. But more importantly, that creates value addition in the economy, and a momentum that drives the economy forward. Whereas in the African continent, there are breakages, particularly between the primary sector and the secondary sector, particularly manufacturing, that most of the raw materials are exported. So it leaves a gap that the manufacturing sectors are not able to process. This is just another illustration of what the linkages are in a mature. So if you think of an economy as made up of three broad sectors: the tertiary sector, the primary sector, and the secondary sector, and they pull resources from each other. In a mature and well-developed economy, we see these sectors actually with a stronger connection. Whereas in Africa, there is much, the connection is not strong, the linkages are not strong, primarily because of the weaker secondary sector, particularly manufacturing, leading to a situation where even the processing of food, like coffee, cocoa, has to be taken outside of the continent, processed, and then brought back for sale. Leaving, so there's a disarticulation there in the economy as a whole. Right. I want to speak also the other type of disarticulation that is very clear and is a symbol of the perpetuation of the colonial economic logic, is the spatial disarticulation and the communication systems. The first map there on the top left with green lines is showing the railway line in Nigeria. Actually, if you look at that, Nigeria is quite a bit more as a more integrated railway system compared to other countries. But even there, you can see that the railway system were built particularly on to areas where the colonial interests were, to the north, to bring in cotton and other things for sale, for export to the south. And then other regions then are left out without connection. If we go to the one and to the top right map there, that's the DRC. And you can see there that some of the railway lines are actually just floating on their own, like the one there at the top there from Bumba to Mangabere and Isoro. It's a standalone line, and it's not connected to anything else. You look at the other one also from Matadi to Kinshasa. It's a small little line that is not connected to anything else. That's also another example. And these are colonial construction, because the colonial companies were interested in, as long as they could get these materials to places where they were able to export, to bring them out. They didn't bother about whether there was any coherency in the economy or not. And we can see also the one at the bottom left there, that's a Zambian one. And you can see the black line there from the border with Zimbabwe. There's a black line. That was a colonial economy going into the copper mines for the extraction of copper and export down south through Zimbabwe, South Africa, and sometimes through. Sorry?
Your internet keeps cutting. I think if you turn off your video, it might work better.
Okay, sure, thank you. Let me do that. Yeah, so are you able to hear me now? Correct. Is it better?
Yes, it's working great.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the bottom left there is the Zambian map, and there's a black line there coming from Zimbabwe all the way up to the copper mines and going into DRC as well. And you see the blue line there added. Those are new additions, and the pink line and the green line, but you can see that they're all not forming a coherent communication system. There's a new addition, the dotted line there, which is the Tazara that goes all the way to Tanzania, which was built by after independence, and as a result of the southern border, is the southern railway line being closed during the Ian Smith regime. But all this shows that very little has been done to transform the colonial infrastructure and its economic rationale. Yes, I'm showing this again. This is from Nigeria, and what we can see that from this is that most of the railway line was the lines were constructed actually before independence. For Nigeria, the only line that was constructed after independence is the Jos and Maiduguri, and most of them, the rationale were mostly for administrative, but also agriculture and mineral extraction. And the key points that this is a study that was done by Onyewenye, and they argue that the construction of a railway line largely occurred between 1895 and 1930. And there was an extension, this is a Jos to Maiduguri line in 1964. And the study found that the export of agricultural products was the main motive for the railway line. Again, that's the colonial rationale, that they were interested to build a railway line so that you could bring in palm oil, you could bring in cotton, you could bring in even cocoa in some areas. This is not an argument, against the colonial logic, but it's an indictment actually on the African post-colonial states, that we have not actually done much to revise and reverse this. Yeah, and this becomes very clear when we look at the continent as a whole. And this is a map of the Africa that is showing the different railway lines connecting to different places. You can see that most of them are disarticulated, not connected in a single way, even in a country. A little bit of a network there in South Africa, but in most of the countries you see they're not connected to anything else or to any other country. And I cite Ake here, arguing that the colonial, Africa, that the infrastructure in colonial Africa is an excellent example of the disarticulation. And that map, I think, confirms the disarticulation, that they didn't constitute in any country a coherent system of communications. Neither did they contribute to the building of a coherent economy, because infrastructure is very critical to economic performance. And where infrastructure is weak, we see a corresponding weakness in economic performance. And so Ake goes on to argue that they were built, ad hoc according to the metropolitan interest of the moment. But the key point to make out of here is that it shows the persistency of the colonial economic logic and an indictment on Africans' failure to transform this. The third evidence of the continuation of the African, the colonial economy in Africa is what I call structural dualism. Now, structural dualism is not just a rural-urban, but it goes to the colonial structure of society that was divided between the settlers or the Europeans and the Africans. And particularly in Southern Africa, that was actually a very strong feature of the colonial economy that Weber, they're writing, saying it was in Nyasaland and Rhodesia, which included Northern and Southern Rhodesia, but also South Africa, that it was an dualism, structured dualism was an all-pervasive phenomenon. And it expressed itself not just in the economic sphere, but in the political, in the social and economic sphere as well. So this has persisted, although in a different form now, more in terms of the rural-urban divide, which is prevalent across the continent. That if you are in an urban area, you live almost a different life from those who are in the rural areas, and that disjuncture is a carry-on from the colonial economy, and we have not transformed that to sort of begin to level or even out some of the benefits of development. The fourth evidence of the presence of capital flight, the presence of colonial economy, the feature, is what capital flight. And I've got is just, and the idea is that money that comes into the continent is far less than money that goes out, and of course that is a structure of extroversion, that the African economy are oriented outwardly, and as a result, the money that is made in there doesn't stay there; it goes out, and there's a graphic way of putting this, and there's several ways in which money goes out. For instance, profit taking, there's debt payment, there is illegal logging, there's tax evasion, and all sorts of things. Yeah, for now it's a little bit more complicated, but in the colonial times, that was just an open, process where the money you make, there were no borders. All the settlers would take it out and bank it elsewhere. Particularly the multinational companies that were operating in there. The fifth, point or evidence of the persistence of the colonial economy is what referred to as looting Africa resources. They have continued. And of course, there was excessive looting of sorts, and that has continued in a more subtle way. For instance, there's that placket there saying, if you don't like looting, if you go to the British Museum, you're going to hate it, because there's a lot of looting from the continent in those museums. And of course, here it's speaking about artifacts and other items that go into museum. But the looting is not limited to that. The right-hand corner there's the African. I assume that's an African leader. And then there's a French leader, the guy, after he has taken all the money, and he says, "Oh, each of us must develop without relying on one another, on others." And then a more graphical one there, just below the British Museum placard there, is this picture of France, this very fat, well-dressed guy being fed by this poorly dressed, almost half naked, guy that's, and malnourished. And it's also showing that some of the relations, it shows that some of the relations there are being very imbalanced and continue to drain African resources. So it's not just a thing of the past. These relations have continued in several ways. Looting machine. This is a book that highlights the instruments of looting in Africa in the past and now. That we in the past we had those multinational and colonialism, but there are warlords that are funded, and civil conflict that is fueled by people from the continent. The corporations, as we have seen, they are the smugglers and the stealing of Africa. Is then the bottom left, right there is a map of Africa showing the grabbing of land. Although the media has actually been quiet. Around 2011, land grabs were in the you know, we're in the top stories in the media, and Africa was, of course, at the center of it. But I assume that you know, these processes have continued, and in some cases with you know, very perverse effects on the continent. I'd like to here just to end this section by summarizing, by quoting Fieldhouse, who was one of the historians, arguing that African colonies were developed in order to produce raw materials, just recapping, while importing manufactures and capital. So he's using the past tense, but I would argue that these processes have continued today, because we're still importing raw materials. Sorry, we're still exporting predominantly raw materials, as I just illustrated earlier at the beginning of the presentation. And we predominantly importing manufacturers and capital. If there's any place where there is, where you know, governments are ready to do anything for foreign, what we refer to as foreign direct investments. And in the continent, we have now even almost a stampede for countries trying to compete each other, just because capital that was made in Africa has gone elsewhere, and we have to plead for it to come back again. Then, how do we? So, what is the solution? What is the solution to? How do we transform then the colonial economy? As my main argument, I was saying that industrial policy can be an instrument for transforming the colonial economy, because it attacks the core of the colonial economic logic, which is raw material export. Industrial policy that is, but it's not just any type of industrial policy, but it's industrial policy that is radical enough to be able to create or reverse and begin to look into to create capacities for manufacturing and other production processes. You know, just to highlight some of what I think would be important for such an instrument on the African continent. I'll just speak to a few here. The important thing is, of course, to, again, it strikes at the core of the colonial economy, because the colonial economy was had this idea that, you know, Africa, because of capital scarce, therefore it did not have a comparative advantage in manufacturing, and because of, you know, small domestic market, therefore you don't have to manufacture, therefore you take out the raw materials, process them in Europe and other places, and then bring them back to Africa. A frontier industrial policy should seek to alter the structure of comparative advantage. In other words, to create a new structure of comparative advantage that favors the African continent. And I've argued elsewhere that this can be done by looking at comparative advantage, not in static terms, but comparative advantage over time. And what African industrial policy should seek to do is to create, to change that structure, which says you have no advantage in manufacturing. And of course, we might not have that, but how do we create the, you know, the capacity to be able to move forward? So that's very crucial for a frontier industrial policy to operate and start from the point that it's possible we can create an advantage, comparative advantage in manufacturing. The second point is to think on the margin. A frontier, by the name itself, is on the frontier of industrial policy, that you think innovatively, that the common place industrial strategies are not going to be able to transform the colonial economy. We will need exceptional and innovative ways of thinking, and I've spoken about this a little bit more in the book that was just published by Routledge on transforming the colonial economy in Africa, but I can't go into the details here. The third aspect that a frontier industrial economy would have is what I call agile and ambitious fit. Again, there's been a lot of debates about state intervention and all, but in a context of Africa, it is very difficult to see how you move forward without the state playing a big role. And by saying that, I'm not saying that the state should establish shops for selling tomatoes or shoes or anything like that, but the state should be the at the driving front of promoting industrial growth, at the driving front of transforming the colonial economy by that colonial logic that tells us that we need to export raw materials, and that will take a radical stance. But it's not just any type of a state. So the state that has to be effective with supporting institutions or effective institutions that can actually implement what is agreed on, what is identified. The fourth aspect of the frontier industrial policy is, here I'd like to highlight the point of creating what I call viable regional value chains. Again, the current structure of global production, particularly manufacturing, makes it very difficult for any single African country to break into global value chains. If you take, for example, the cell phone value chain, the African role has always been to provide coltan and small things with a value of less than 5% of the total value chain. Now, and it's going to be very difficult because of the way production has been structured, particularly the fragmentation of production, lines, and we have evidence that's showing that and the situation is getting tighter. But also the suppliers and the buyers within the global chains who are very powerful and influence things, that favor developed countries like the US, China, and so on. And so so the strategy for a frontier industrial is to begin to domesticate some of these value chains at a regional level or continental level. Again, that would require creating building industrial capabilities within the continent, particularly the manufacturing sector. The fifth one that I want to speak about as a strong, there's need for what I refer to here as strong PLN, and it's very simple. That if a country like Rwanda is making progress, it's very easy for Tanzania to learn from Rwanda than to learn from the US, or learn from Korea or China. And so, frontier industrial policy can begin to say, let's begin to identify, cases within Africa with the potential for success, or industrial policies within Africa with the potential for success. And then we learn from what they are doing to make that progress. And there are a couple of them, Rwanda has been in the media saying they've been aggressive. Of course, I mean, that's not yet there, but they are making an effort to create capabilities, to create capacity for manufacturing, but believing also in themselves that, look, we can alter the current structure of comparative advantage in the country. And then to conclude, just to wrap up, I was given 45 minutes, and I want to stay within that so that we can have some time for conversation. So just the key points that are coming out of here, of this presentation that I would like to end with is that Africa has to reverse the colonial economic logic, and that would entail breaking with the rationale of the Acts of Berlin. When the Europeans started in 1885 to petition Africa and create a maze of these countries that we have today, they had no interest of the Africans in the continent. They saw only their own interest, which could be political, economic, and so on. So to transform that, Africa has to break with that thinking, which unfortunately still continues today in the way the economies are structured. I also want to make the point that, what I said earlier, that the brutal and far-reaching effects of the colonial project in Africa particularly, cannot be undone by standard development economic growth theories, particularly by neoclassical theories. Yet that you need more radical interventions to be able to turn things around. And for the past 60 years, we have made little progress, perhaps because we haven't been radical enough. Also, just to speak to the idea of an incomplete project, to recognize that the efforts that were made in the 60s, 70s, and then things started raveling. If we are to transform the colonial economy today, we have to double those efforts. And again, that speaks to the radicalism of the strategies, also the state policies themselves. Again, just to recap here, that making things matter, and making things matter a great deal in Africa, if Africa is to make progress to improve the well-being and the dignity of the people that have been actually completely devastated by the colonial experience. And we are seeing this now, that making things matter in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where well, in all developed countries, we are manufacturing, the vaccine, and yet on the continent we are waiting for something that falls out. That's a surplus from France, that's a surplus from Germany, that's a surplus from the USA, and in the meantime, would continue to die. So that's a very clear sign that if you're making things matter, and it matters a great deal. Yeah, industrial policy, a radical one, can actually play an important role in reversing the colonial economic logic. And again, here, there's a lot of hype around the continental free trade area. And I want to make an argument again that promoting free trade on its own will not do much, that we have to create production capacities within different countries so that we can deepen the trade within Africa. The trading alone is not going to reverse the colonial economic logic. And lastly, strong and effective institutions would be critical to this process. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to end there and hand over to the program director to guide us with in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chitonge. And I think you can turn on your video. We thought it would help, but it wasn't that. But overall, we heard you very well. So I think if you want to turn it on, that would be fine. And to everybody, you can use the Q&A section to write your questions if you have one. And for me, I will just start by asking if you can just tell us what, if I understand well, you said that there was an effort, at least after the independence, to change this, but it did not go through, that it stopped in the 80s. What particularly, what happened that made it, why the governments did not go with the project of changing it in the 80s?
Okay. Can I comment on that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yes, so I think in the 80s, sorry, in the 60s, we had policies that were designed to overturn the colonial thinking and the colonial structures. For instance, the leaning towards development planning that was very strong within most African countries. They emphasized the idea that the state had to play a big role in ensuring that we catch up. There's this idea of catching up with the rest of the continent. And a couple of countries made a bit of progress in terms of creating industrial capacities. But of course, that started to unravel, particularly starting from the crisis, the first crisis in 1973, immediately after independence, that most of the countries ran into problems with foreign exchange. They couldn't buy parts to repair the machines that were, in the factories and so on, and buy inputs. And then by the 80s was a break, because from the 1980s, then we had the financial institutions, particularly the World Bank and the IMF, coming in and saying, look, the reason why you have experienced a crisis is because there's been too much state intervention in the economy, and actually because of the industrial policy. So abandon industrial policy, start embracing a market-led economy, and everything will be fine. So we actually stopped even implementing industrial policy. It's only, in the 2000s that we are beginning to see industrial policy coming back on the agenda. In fact, several African countries now have formulated industrial policies which they are seeking to implement. So we had that gap, and that's specifically because of when the structural adjustment programs came in, they recommended that industrial policy itself, because it brings in state intervention, was a problem. And as a result, the efforts that were made were all thrown away, and we opened up everything, and we embraced the market, free market approach. And of course, we find ourselves in the same place, that we haven't made much progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So coming to the questions, what is a specific example of exceptional rather than standard industrial policy that could make a significant difference?
Right, yeah, so a standard one is where you say, okay, we're going to follow the comparative advantage of, the current comparative advantage in a static way. That means, okay, I don't have a comparative advantage in making computers, and therefore I'll keep on producing coffee and tea. That's a standard one. And then I'll trade my tea and buy laptops. That's a very standard way of thinking. But an exceptional one is the one that says, wait a minute, if I can build a capacity to make laptops and export laptops, I'll probably be in a better position than I am. What I need then, therefore, is to begin to say, what is it that I can do for me to get a point where I have an advantage in making laptops? And there's a basic thing that industrial policy highlights, that there's no country that started with a comparative advantage in anything. These were created over time. And I think that's what an exceptional industrial policy has to be articulating, that comparative advantage can be created, even where it doesn't exist. Of course, it can be created from nothing, and it can't be created overnight. It has to be created over time. And that requires consistent policy implementation and commitment, that even if it's after 10 years or 20 years, I want to make robots as the main thing. If Malawi, wants to do that, they have to begin. If you don't begin and and the standard industrial policy will tell you, don't even go there because you won't succeed. You don't have. But if you keep staying where you are, you never move from where you are. That's a simple fact. And so an exceptional one is the one that seeks to turn the tables around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any examples of African countries that are making progress towards reversing the colonial economy? Yes,
I would say there are some, but the progress has been slow, and there's a reason. There's a structural reason for that, which I touched on a little bit, but let me see if I can explain that again. So, for instance, for a small economy of Rwanda, which is about, the total GDP is about $13 billion. To make progress and headway into transforming the colonial economy, it's very difficult, for the simple reasons that the structure of global production has become so segmented and controlled by very, high concentration of power in developed countries that it's difficult for Rwanda, for instance, to break into making, cell phones and electric cars without into this global market. But Rwanda can Rwanda can begin to think of the continent as a market. And of course, I mean, the continent at the moment, of course, the spending power is very low. But still, if you think of the 1.3 billion people on the continent, even if you assume that only 10% of those have purchasing power, that gives you quite 130 million people, and it gives you quite a bit of market. If you think of Rwanda with 16 million people, and 10%, that's 100, it's very small. So in other words, there's been some countries that have shown signs of the commitment to transforming the colonial economy, but the progress has been slow because of the structures around that, the smallness of the economy, but also in the past lack of cooperation between African countries. It's going to be, and that's the argument I make in the book also, that for this process of transforming the colonial economy to achieve any substantive progress, you will have to have a lot more African countries combining, cooperating, creating, for instance, regional value chains, and enlarging the markets as a stepping stone for creating manufacturing and industrial capabilities. I'm not sure if I answered that question properly.
Yeah, the question was from Kwame. I think you said Kwame.
Yes.
Okay, so Anna has a question. I would like to know your opinion about the effective role African Union has been performing in order to integrate African economies all over the continent.
Sorry, I didn't hear. There was a break there a little bit. Could you please repeat the question?
So Anna is asking your opinion about what role the African Union has done in order to help the African economies to integrate.
Yeah, so the African Union has been advocating for integration from the Organization of African Unity. In the 1980s, when they came up with the Lagos Plan of Action, they actually drew up a plan to create the African Economic Community. And that plan was, they moved a step further in 1993 and adopted the Abuja Treaty, which outlined a plan for the integration of the continent by the year 2028. But the role of the African Union has been, they've pushed regional integration through the various organs of the Union, particularly NEPAD. In 2010, NEPAD was integrated within the African Union. Before that, it was operating almost like a sideline institution based in Johannesburg, but it's now been integrated in the African Union structures. And it's been tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that they promote regional integration and African integration. And the NEPAD's approach has been, to pick up, of course, from the Abuja Treaty, which had this idea that the best way to promote regional integration in Africa is to start with regional economic communities. And if the regional economic communities are more integrated, then you can integrate the rents themselves to create a more integrated African Union. Of course, that hasn't moved very well, but there has been a momentum that has actually emerged around the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which negotiations that started again within the structures of the African Union in 2012, and then in 2018 they signed the the free trade agreement. And we are seeing a little bit of momentum towards integration. And of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area came into effect beginning of this year. And the African Union role has been in the forefront in pushing for that. So it's been very central. The big question is whether this momentum will be sustained and it will lead to further integration beyond trade. As I was arguing in the paper, that trade alone will do very little to push that unless trade stimulates the production capacities in countries, which in most cases it should be the other way around. That if we produce more, then we stimulate trade within ourselves. And so the key issue is more productive capacity within the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard Stern has a question. Horman, thanks for a great talk. I would like to hear more about the political economy of transforming the colonial economy, in particular, the issue of the political will in African countries, the policy space available in a world dominated by institutions with a vested interest in the neoliberal order and the capabilities to implement new industrial focused strategies, including how you stimulate new economic thinking on a continent where neoclassic economics is so dominant.
Yeah, thank you, Howard, and thanks for coming to the seminar. Yeah, so that's a big challenge, but I would like to think that there are some radical voices that are beginning to emerge. Especially the younger people who are saying, wait a minute, this global system hasn't worked for Africa for centuries. Why should we trust it? Why should we continue playing along? And they are beginning to the dominant voices within policy making, the dominant views within policy making is actually imbued by neoclassical economic thinking, which in the policy space has been infiltrated by that. Yesterday, I was just at the meeting where we were discussing the date problem on the continent and the role of the IMF. And some of the senior, government officials within African governments were making the argument that, please, you have to you can't say anything against the IMF. They'll go away, and we need them. And you can see that they buy into this idea of the fact that when you implement neoclassical views, the economy will turn around and you get everything in order. And so, yeah, the policy space at the moment is being infiltrated by neoclassical ideas. But I see a little bit of hope from the younger people who are beginning to question that. Of course, at the moment, they don't have the power, but we hope that these voices can grow and become a force that would force the politicians and other policymakers to begin to listen. The other way to create this policy space is to begin to speak to the policymakers. Of course, most of them won't listen, but to speak and write about and expose also the weakness of neoclassical thinking. There's an interesting paper by Frederick Cooper. He was critiquing neoclassical thinking, that one of the weaknesses of neoclassical thinking is that it fails to analyze power. It thinks that economic relations or economic transactions or interactions should take place outside of power. and yet they are embroidered in power relations and interest, vested interest, which I thought was very interesting. That we know that France, when France is interacting with Mali, whether it's through a loan, there are huge power relations, but also vested interest in there. And Mali has to do very well to begin to, unmask some of those problems that are actually clouded out by neoclassical thinking. So yes, I think that's a challenge, but we can still create a space, particularly if the voice that begin to expose the weakness of neoclassical thinking, particularly in Africa. Neoclassical thinking is dominant, but it has never worked in Africa, and perhaps it has never worked well anywhere else. Now, that would be my argument. Thank you.
Thank you. Kwame has another question. Building a viable industrial policy requires investment. At a time when most African countries are facing a debt crisis, how could countries creatively fund this policy?
Yeah, so investment here is of course a big problem. And I was one of the slides there was showing that the money that is made in Africa actually end up leaving. It doesn't stay in Africa, but and sometimes we have to beg that money to come back in form of foreign direct investments. So one way to stem that is, and I know that some of it is just through illegal, means that it leaves, but some of it is to stem to come up with policies that would ensure that some of the monies that are made on the continent are not taken out. And it's, for instance, profit taking could be limited to a particular ratio, not where you give a blanket check that you can take whatever profit you make and take it out. Because even the legal, through legal means, the profit is taken out. So you saw, if those figures in that particular slide were correct, that profit taking accounts for more than 46 billion, every year. Now, if you were to capture that, even half of it, to stay on the continent, it will provide a resource for undertaking some of these structural reforms that I've been speaking about. That's one thing. The other thing is that the African governments could, if they are able to cooperate together, could take regional projects. For instance, we have an industrial SADC, Southern Africa industrial policy, and if those 15 countries could raise funds together to implement industrial projects for the region, that is another way that you could raise capital rather than Malawi or South Africa going it alone. There is also a regional industrial policy in ECOWAS. There is also a regional industrial policy in East Africa. So we have those initiatives, but it's implementing them. And if we can implement them, and if you read them, you can actually see that the ideas they have are great. They speak about, creating industries that are complementary across countries in the region. And that's the way that you actually build a regional value chains. Because if you say Malawi focus on producing tobacco, South Africa will process the tobacco into finished, and then we'll export, and then Zimbabwe focus on this, and you create regional industrial projects that are complementary. That's another way. And at the regional level, it's easier to raise the capital than for countries to do it alone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So Milo has a question. Some African leaders and analysts have argued that it is not possible to correct the problems and injustices that were created outside the law using the law. They suggest that the solutions can only be found outside the law. Zimbabwe tried it. What is your take?
Right, yes. So, of course, there's this argument that colonialism was illegal, and therefore, yes, it was an illegal undertaking, It's a project that was undertaken with no consent from Africans and the people here. But and for sure, you know, if you are going to transform, if you are going to seek to reverse that, or at least to deal with the effects of that through the normal or conventional thinking, it's not going to take us very far. And one of the suggestions I made in the paper is that you need radical thinking. I know that the question is perhaps thinking of extra legal means of transforming the colonial economy. I don't think that that's a very feasible way of doing it, but you can transform the colonial economy by radical means, where you begin to say, you know, the best way to break the rationale that keeps on reproducing the same structures in our economy is for us, for instance, to cooperate and create regional economies that will have a bigger, scale economies that will have bigger markets where we can begin to produce for local markets predominantly before and create capacity. Those are radical. I mean, that's a radical in the African context actually today. That's radical because the countries are so fragmented that South Africa only think of South Africa alone. Zimbabwe thinking of Zimbabwe alone. So if you were to revolutionize that and begin to say, it's after all colonialism that separated us, why can't we reverse that? So that's the beginning of a radical thinking itself, where you begin to say, how did we find ourselves here in the first place? Who actually were we there when they came up and said, this is South Africa, this is Zimbabwe? None of us were there. And so the most radical way is to begin to say, let's reverse that in the first place, and therefore we can make progress without being acting outside of the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one last question, and maybe then you can just say your closing words. So Anne asked, how can education be part of the driving front in breaking away from the colonial economy, given that the existing and colonial education of the African was meant to serve the colonial economy project?
Yeah, so education, of course, it's very central. Part of the question that Howard was asking about, what can we do, also touches on that, in the sense that you will need to raise awareness, among people that the system that we are operating in is not working for us. And that starts from education. Education from the official curriculum, where you begin to question some of these theories, some of the ideas that we use on the continent. And we have seen a little bit of that coming up, particularly here at UCT, where we had the students beginning to say, we want to decolonize the curriculum. And they started the campaign, within the Roads Must Fall. Then there was a campaign that we need a curriculum that speaks to African experience, African realities. And I think education then can be very central there, because we have to ask a question to say, what is our education system doing to contribute to transforming this? It's about also transforming the way we think. And if we are copying the curriculum of Harvard doesn't have the same experience as the African continent. Although we want to be able to speak to people in other parts of the continent or other parts of the globe, but we have to draw from our own strength. And I think that's where education comes in, where we begin to say, what is it that Africa can draw from its own resources to be able to engage with people from outside. So education is very crucial in that respect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chitonge. I learned a lot, and I hope the attendees also learned. And thank you everybody else who attended. So we'll see you next Thursday. Thank you again, Dr. Chitonge.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.